Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello and welcome back. It's Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. Today on the line with us from the Ottawa area, I think, area code 613 anyway, Carolyn Whitzman. And we're talking about a book called Clara at the Door with a Revolver. So Clara, thank you very much for taking some time to be with us today. How's the book doing so far?
The book's doing really well, thanks. So much so that my name is getting confused with the name of my subject. So it was launched in the beginning of February, and I'm really very impressed with the coverage it's gotten, and also the fact that it's in bookstores across Canada.
And it's called, like we said, Clara at the Door with a Revolver by Carolyn Whitzman, and so that's where the confusion came. So I understand there's quite the story about how you stumbled upon this whole incident. Can you go back? I know you've probably repeated this before, but tell us again how this all started, please.
Right. So this is a true story, a true crime story about a woman named Clara Ford, who was arrested in 1894 for the murder of a rich white young man. She was a black woman, and the murder victim, Frank, had been her next door neighbor. 20 years ago, I was doing research for my PhD, and I was looking at housing policy in the Toronto neighborhood of Parkdale, and I had already bumped up against a myth that started in the 1970s that Parkdale had been a stable middle-class residential area when it was being developed, and all you needed to do was walk around Parkdale. I lived in Parkdale at that point, and you'd see industrial buildings and you'd see very small workers' cottages. So clearly, industry and residential, rich and poor, were cheek by jowl in Parkdale. I was looking at newspaper articles of the time to get a sense of what the social life was like, and whether people were living, for instance, in rooming houses, which they were. And I came across a mention of this murder case, and I just dove into it because it fascinated me because of the housing conditions, the very rich house by the lake shore, and then a shack nearby where this three-generational family of single mothers lived. And then I just got fascinated by the trial itself. I moved to Australia when my PhD ended and lived there for 16 years. But when the opportunity came to return to Canada, I decided I would return to that story. I was very there's been a bit written about the case. Much of it doesn't get into the circumstances of the alleged murderess, Clara Ford. She was actually acquitted. And I was just fascinated with how many aspects of 19th century Toronto society was still relevant to 21st century Canada.
And we're talking about the Toronto area in the 1890 to 1914 era. So how close to, let's say, Nathan Phillips Square would this area be for those of us, such as myself, who don't know Toronto all that well?
Okay. Well, actually, you couldn't be closer to Nathan Phillips Square when it comes to Clara. She was born in a low-income slum of Toronto, which was called Macaulaytown in 1861. Later, it became better known as the Ward, as in, what is the Ward going to do with Toronto? And it was the area where poor people, but also marginalized people, like black people, Jews, a very small smattering of Asian origin people lived. then Clara and her mother Jessie needed to move a lot around the city, and they ended up in Parkdale, which was then a leafy green suburb about 3 miles, 5 kilometers west of downtown. But just as before the murder, Clara had to leave Parkdale and move back into the ward, and so she lived just south of where City Hall was. In fact, she had lived at the corner where old City Hall was, but her house had been torn down and replaced by City Hall. She lived on York Street, which is now lawyers' offices, high-rise buildings, but at the time was sort of the epicenter of the ward.
And we're talking about the era of like I said, 1890 to 1914. So I'm getting the feeling from reading the book that Toronto was sort of all British all the time. Is that kind of the way they were back then?
Well, that's certainly the self-image that they had. They had an image that they were, even though Montreal was a much more populous city, that they were the center of Canada first. The notion that Canada was white and British and Protestant, and that it would be a moral force within Canada. And in the meantime, there was a great deal of hypocrisy because there were a lot of women who were being seduced or raped by their male employers, getting pregnant, dying of abortions, and Clara was caught up in that. Clara had been put in, well, certainly sentenced to 6 months in jail when she was 12 years old on grounds of having been a vagrant, which meant that she was on the street without a good excuse of why she was walking on the street. And she certainly was subject to a great deal of harassment and assault, leading to the fact that she had a revolver. Many people had guns in those days to protect themselves. In fact, there was a gun in the house where Frank Westwood lived and died. And to be treated as a very eccentric and possibly dangerous woman, Clara, because there was at least one incident of her having fought back against sexual harassment on the streetcar.
Now we're talking about, like I said, 1890, 1914. Speaking of guns, gun laws back then seemed to be a bit rather looser than they are today. Is that right? It seems like every time you turn around in the book, someone has a gun.
Yes, a lot of people had guns, and indeed there was a very early form of forensics used on the gun that shot Frank. It could have been the gun that Clara had. It also could have been, according to the court testimony, one of 5,000 guns that were of a similar make in Toronto at the time. So given that Toronto had maybe 250,000 people in the 1890s, that tends to point towards a high level of gun ownership. Again, Clara had to walk 5 kilometers to Parkdale and back on a Sunday because streetcars couldn't run because of Sabbath laws. So Frank Westwood's father was a well-known teetotaler, someone who is for prohibition of alcohol. So there's a very high level of hypocrisy where people are talking about virtuousness but are actually doing the opposite.
Carolyn Whitzman is here. This is Clara at the Door with a Revolver. That's what intrigued me, was the title. That's a great title. Did that just pop into the brain one day? That's a wonderful title. How'd that come about?
Just one moment. I'll freely admit that the title came from my wonderful publisher, UBC Press, On Point. The book is intended to be a fun book to read. I mean, it is about a murder case. It is about a murder mystery because, as I say, Clara was acquitted, and there was another another neighbor, Gus Clark, who sold vibrators by day and was a burglar by night, who was the other chief suspect. The main reason, I don't think I've mentioned this before, that Clara was a suspect was because Frank lived briefly after he was shot. He said he was shot by a middle-aged man. Clara was known to wear men's clothes and, in fact, had a man's suit. And so she was the suspect because she was poor and she was black and she was a single mom, but also because she had a men's suit of clothes and was known to have walked about in men's clothes, which in the 1890s was considered very suspicious and tittillating.
But at the same time, we have, at least the impression I get from the book is that it was a rather exuberant nightlife or entertainment scene in Ontario or Toronto at the time, with lots of stage shows, etc., going on that featured performers of all sorts.
Yes, and one of the curiosities of Clara's case is that she was 33 when she was acquitted, and she left to become a member of the first all-black vaudeville troupe. So Clara was known to have an excellent voice. Clara was the first woman to defend herself in a criminal case in Canada, and she used those skills that she had in expressing herself and convincing an all-white, all-male jury that she'd been forced into a false confession by the police. She then used those skills as a performer and became a performer at the somewhat advanced age for those days of 33 or 34.
And we get the saying Toronto the Good from that era as well. How did that come about?
Well, as I say, Toronto saw itself as the moral center of of Canada.
It still does.
It saw itself as well, as I say, there's a lot of parallels. So Toronto saw itself as a place that would lead work against the demon drink. It would be very much supporting values of Protestant education. Of course, residential schools were an aspect of that. There was theater. There was also a lot of moral codes about what could play and what couldn't play in theater. So, as I say, there's very high levels of hypocrisy going on in Toronto the Good in 1890s.
And it seems that also the church life was a big factor in all of this. You mentioned there was like 6 churches kind of in the area around the murder house, I'll call it, but no Catholics, so they're all Protestant churches.
Yeah. So there were 6 congregations in Parkdale, but very much not a Catholic church. That was for other neighborhoods. And Clara herself was, and her mother, were both quite involved in the Anglican church, and that's part of the reason why, even though Clara had left Parkdale, she'd return every Sunday to go to St. Mark's Church, an Anglican church, and she said that after one of those Sunday visits to the church, she had been assaulted by Frank Westwood. That's what she said in her alleged confession, which she then refuted on the stand.
You've got lots of illustrations in the book, sort of like from that era that you see in Sherlock Holmes books and Victorian type stories and newspapers, because photography wasn't that big at the time. How did you get all of those done?
Well, the newspapers were the main form of media in the 19th century, and there were 7 newspapers in Toronto at the time of Frank's shooting, and all 7 were engaged in a furious circulation war. So the newspapers went wild. And there were a couple of newspapers in particular that prided themselves on being illustrated for people with fairly low literacy skills. And of course, the idea of this exotic black woman dressed in men's clothes excited newspaper illustrators and a woman on trial for her life. You can see how the newspapers went wild and the newspaper illustrators went wild.
And did all those newspapers, I guess they must have been an immense or large part of your research into this era?
Indeed. In fact, 20 years ago, when I first became sort of obsessed with the story, I read the newspapers in order. And that's when I became convinced that the few historical accounts of Clara were very influenced by one particular reporter, Hector Charlesworth, who was a 23-year-old reporter for the Toronto World at the time. And he actually is the first, at least he wrote the first article that I've found in North America that uses the term homosexual to, which he used to refer to Clara as part of this attempt to sort of make her out to be a monster because she wore men's clothes. It was transphobia as much as anything. So the newspapers very quickly lined themselves up. Some were very anti-Clara, and Hector, as I say, later wrote his memoirs, which are where a lot of the lies about the case come from. He was a very gleeful liar. He said in his memoirs, well, sometimes I published fakes, but sometimes they were true. So he was saw himself in the role of Clara's chief persecutor. Another newspaper, the Toronto Telegram, which still survives today as the Toronto Sun, saw itself as Clara's main defender. And in fact, 3 people working for the newspaper testified on her behalf in the trial. So the news media not only covered the trial, they very much became a part of the trial.
And that's fun going back and looking at those old newspapers. I do that quite often as well. Clara at the Door with a Revolver by Carolyn Whitzman. It's the scandalous black suspect, the exemplary white son, and the murder that shocked Toronto. One quick question before we go. What do you hope readers will take from this book? And I'm going to assume there's going to be lots of readers. So what's your goal with this book?
Well, thank you. I love history, and I often find that while English history and U.S. history is written in a very lively fashion, and indeed, I'm old enough that I grew up with Pierre Berton, I wanted to write a book that sort of reconsidered a time and a place in Canadian history, but made it interesting and lively enough that people would read it just because it's such a great story. And on the way, they might find some interesting parallels around racism and about sexual violence and about as you say, the notion of what's a moral bunch of people. So there's a little bit of about policing, about law. I think that there's a lot of parallels in Clara's story that reverberate today, and so it's supposed to be a good read, but also something to think about.
And it is. It's Carolyn Whitzman's book, Clara at the Door with a Revolver. Thank you very much for your time today, and good luck with this book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.